Oh, thank you as always.
No problem.
Couldn't do it without you. Alright. Okay, dude, we got our water.
Yeah.
We got... Oh. We got some nice props here.
Yeah, man.
We got a pretty decent setup.
Check.
Face to face. Mic is all...
Look like we're sounding okay.
perfect. Exactly. Today's the 9th.
Today is the 9th.
9th of February, 1:48 p.m.
I think this is the first time we've done a consecutive podcast.
I may very well be. So I wanted to stop saying so quite so often, but I also wanted to talk to you today about sort of spirituality.
Yeah.
And maybe a little about religion.
For sure.
And maybe a bit about horoscopes and tarot and all of this other
Some stuff like that. Absolutely.
Because there are places I think where we see pretty clear eye to eye on this stuff, and there's places where, well, it's not so much that we're not like seeing eye to eye. It's just that there's stuff that I just aren't patient with and don't care about.
Yeah.
And that you have more patience for and care a bit more about.
For sure, and with all of, I think spirituality is very subjective and very intimate and very personal, in a way that religion often isn't.
Straight off the bat.
Straight off the bat, yeah. So, I think one of the big things is there's going to be stuff that resonates with some people that just doesn't resonate with other people. Totally. And that's totally fine.
So talk to me a little about that sort of division in your life, spirituality versus religion.
Yeah, with all of these concepts, they can get a little messy when you try to define them too much. But I think one of the big things I think about with spirituality is as I see it, is very personal, is very intimate.
Mm-hmm.
It's an intimate relationship with... an Irish writer I like called John O'Donohue. He's a very Celtic spiritual person, really smart. But John O'Donohue. He calls it the invisible world. So,
Do you have a book of his or something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like a name?
Yeah. Do you want me to grab it?
No, you can just give me a name.
Yeah, he's got a book called Anam Cara.
Anam Cara.
Which is soul friend in Gaelic. So,
very cool.
Really cool. Talking about kind of our relationship with the sort of unseen world, and that can include things like God, but it can also include abstract ideas like beauty, like faith, sort of concepts that love that come into our daily life, but we can't necessarily sort of pin down and pinpoint a picture of.
Totally.
But so spirituality for me kind of represents that intimacy with those kinds of things.
Gotcha. So yeah. I had kind of a cheeky thought as you were talking. It all sounds very Protestant to me.
Yeah, that's right.
Talk about your Catholic upbringing.
Yeah, so absolutely. So, I was very lucky to be raised in a really progressive Catholic household, in part to my mom and, in large part to my dad. Mm-hmm. And so my Catholicism is very much informed by liberation theology, which is, a very large kind of topic to get into.
Yeah, but you could... What is liberation theology?
So liberation theology is the idea that the gospel at its core and the writings of Jesus Christ and is a force of social liberation for people. It's a revolutionary force. It is about anti-oppression, and it is involved in the core principles that Jesus espoused on how we should treat one another and applying that to a society.
Cool.
It took root in oppressed nations in the global South, in particular South America and Central America, in the 70s and 80s.
To go in sort of line with their socialist revolutions.
Exactly, to go in line with their socialist revolutions. And it was called very much by Western Catholics for a while, and especially the forces in the Vatican that like to keep things as it were, communist. It was identified with communism, but it's not really, it's not really synonymous, even though some people might identify as both, but they're not the same thing.
So liberation theology, it makes sense from its origins that it has its roots in the Catholic Church.
That's right.
Because South America is incredibly Catholic.
Definitely.
But in all sorts of other ways, it does seem to be more of a Protestant phenomenon.
For sure. Definitely.
Is that something that you and your father have sort of interacted with?
Well, it's fascinating because one of the a bunch of writers on this talk about a decentering of the church, which is super radical. So they talk
Yeah,
about...
I mean, that's basically Protestantism.
Well, but it's not necessarily...
Not quite.
Not quite. And it's not a separation from the church. It's not kind of saying we're a new church. We're not...
it's changing the structure.
It's changing the structure, exactly. And the key is, you know, that... this idea that we still want to maintain our Catholic faith and our Catholic lineage. We still want to be Catholic in that sense. We still want to belong to the overarching structure of the church, but more like, you know, this is what the church should be, and this is what the Catholic Church should represent.
Yeah.
You know, it is at its core, it's extremely radical, but almost like instead of it being a kind of separation and creating a new organism, it's almost like we're inhabiting the same body, but just radically changing the motor functions and where this whole thing is headed.
Well, it encapsulates the very paradox of the center of the Catholic Church,
exactly.
which is that it's the center of dogma,
yeah,
but also has to change and do things in response to the world around
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the this is where kind of syncretism comes in.
Ooh, what's that?
So syncretism is really interesting. You know, it's a word that generally means putting two sort of often contradictory streams and containing them together in a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, according to this history book called Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari,
yep.
It is the most popular religion in the world.
Syncretism.
Because everybody's nowadays putting exactly. You might even be a syncretist under those definitions. You know,
maybe.
I'll let you self-identify of that. You know, I kind of see myself involved in that situation, and part of the reason that
I mean, if I may, your relationship with faith seems very syncretic.
Yes, it is.
That's the right word.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. It absolutely is. You know, especially because, you know, one of the things that I struggled with growing up is I think a lot of conscious Christians and people, especially Catholics, who have to deal with the Vatican and the dogma, even on an intellectual basis, is we all go through a crisis of faith. Like, do we want to be Christians anymore? Do we want to be Catholics anymore? Mm-hmm. I know my dad probably struggled with that, you know, especially when you have values that seem at odds with the larger faith.
Totally.
But, you know, for me, I kind of see it as a lineage. Like, my ancestors have been Catholic for a very long time, but I don't necessarily see that in being incompatible with me incorporating other religious traditions and other spiritual traditions.
For sure.
And I think especially that is true in the case of liberation theology, because it arose out of this fascinating period when originally Jesuits came over and started missions in South America and to a certain extent in North America. And in South America, Jesuits and the indigenous people, without wanting to kind of paint a sort of carte blanche and just sort of simplify it, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of tension between the indigenous people and the church at this time. But often what happened was the Jesuits and these indigenous people were allied together against the Spanish.
Yeah.
Because the Jesuits, believed that these people should not be enslaved.
Well, it's funny because I just read the Candid.
Yes, yeah.
As we were talking about the other day, and the Jesuits are recurring characters.
Absolutely, and that's by Voltaire, right?
Exactly.
Voltaire's Candide. Also really interesting.
So you have this base in your family's Catholicism.
That's right.
But a particularly strange and progressive sort of Catholicism.
Yes.
And then I think you do, as you grow up, you say you have this crisis of faith.
Right.
And you to a certain extent, I think you resolve it with syncretism.
Yeah, exactly.
But what was that process like, getting from, I guess what I'm really asking is were you sort of questioning what aspects of the question of spirituality and religion were you questioning? Were you
Absolutely.
questioning God? Were you questioning the relationship you could have with God?
Yeah.
Was it about sort of the actuality of this thing?
Right.
Or was it more about how you interact with that concept?
Absolutely. I think, one of the things that we deal with. And I was very thankful to be, we talk a lot about this, like an intellectual understanding of God, but even within that, you're still, when you attend Catholic Mass and you attend, Catholic sort of rituals and services, you're inundated with a version of God that sometimes can be the antithesis of a more intellectual version of God. Even just the imagery of God as a, tall, white, bearded man, benevolently associated with sort of bestowing his good grace, his key word, his good graces on humans, even though I don't see God personally as having a gender. You still, so one of the things for me was, I seem to have, with the exception of my father and some of the more progressive Catholics, I seem to have a very different understanding of God than a lot of other people that are in the church, including the priests. So for me, it's like, do I really want to belong to something that, seems to have a very antithetical understanding of God that's almost anathema to me, Yeah. And so that was one of the big ones as well.
So are you Catholic?
Yeah, exactly. I still think I am because, I
Born a Catholic, die a Catholic.
Yeah, exactly. And it's hard and it's difficult because one of the things is I really think, I'm a syncretist, but I'm also, part of my syncretism is Catholicism. But it's evolving and changing. And now I have, I do practices that some of the, indigenous elders that I've worked with have taught me how to do. There's simple things. I would never do an indigenous ceremony, but I do offer tobacco now.
Yeah. And there's this a full treatment of this topic will definitely wait for.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. Yeah.
But there's a really remarkable and peculiar relationship between the indigenous people and Christianity.
Absolutely.
And incredibly polarizing, I think.
Yeah.
But
there's also syncretists in it.
Yeah, but also, I'm thinking of that carol that I've sung, the Huron Carol, which is a mesh of those traditions.
Exactly.
And a beautiful carol.
And a really nice, beautiful carol. Yeah.
So let me sort of bring you back to the same kind of question.
Yeah.
Really. What was your sort of how did you go about the process from this crisis of belief towards something more syncretic?
Absolutely. So I think, at a certain point, and I think it was in school, after high school, because I was thinking a lot about this in high school, especially as we're, exposed to philosophy and different theology and different ways of thinking about these things. We had a many conversation together at that time. But at some point I kind of stopped having a spiritual practice altogether in my sort of early 20s.
Right.
And I wasn't really interested in having one. I didn't think about it. I just kind of put it on the shelf and was like, I guess I'm kind of Catholic, but I don't really sort of identify as a practicing Catholic. I'm just going to kind of put a pin in it and just keep it there, not really think or engage with that part of things, And I think it was more just because I didn't really have a way to resolve it, these questions. And there were other ones like, the legacy of colonialism is a big one with the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
You got to talk about that, Like, is it worth being, people talk about, how we're doing reconciliation in the church. But I was really thinking, like, is this something like I want to be a part of? Like, isn't it better to just reject that and move
reject the whole institution?
Yeah, exactly.
Trying to reconcile.
Try and work exactly. My understanding of that. So that's where I was at for a while,
right.
And then back when I was in New York and I started to work in New York, I was surrounded in my physical environment by instances of a really profound syncretic tradition called Santeria. Santeria, yeah, really interesting, because it's originally from the Yoruba people in Africa, brought over as enslaved people to the Caribbean, and they, by Catholics, by the Spanish and others, and made to work as enslaved people. But in order to keep their traditions, they used the figurines and effigies of saints as symbols for their gods and their spirits. And then over a long period of time, the saints and the orishas, as they're called, the deities in that tradition, merged into the same entities. Yeah. And then that tradition was brought through the migrations of Caribbean people to New York, was brought to the parks that I worked in, and people would make offerings to the deities, to these saints, but also these orishas. Cool. And reading a lot on it, I realized that that authorities who are, scholars of Santeria and in the church talk about how originally this was a way to hide our true religion from colonial eyes and authorities, but over time they really did blend together.
Because the authorities would be more allowing to a tradition that looked something like Christianity.
Exactly, exactly. And it was a blending together that is now, officially understood as that this is a true syncretic religion. This is not just disguising our faith anymore. This marriage of the two is our faith. So that's fascinating to me.
So you had a crisis of belief, and then you were exposed to this this really clear evidence of syncretic religion.
Exactly.
And then how do you resolve
Definitely.
How do you progress from there?
So one of the big things this was about a relationship with the land. In the culture as I understood it, and I'm not an authority on Santeria, but talking to people who practice Santeria in New York City, you do your rituals in nature. So you do your rituals honoring the landscape and having a particular relationship with the land, because that's where the orishas live, or that's where you can access them, or that's where you can talk to them. And I really liked that idea. I liked the idea of having the relationship with, especially in the city, where there's not a lot of natural spaces. So the places that are naturalized, that are natural and have resisted urbanization, become that more sacred to these people. So that's something I started to do. I started to go and do my own kind of just rituals and practices, light a candle or just pray in the woods. Yep. And that sort of got me thinking more and more about my own spirituality again and rediscovering it. Yeah.
So that interaction with the land also, you can see roots in it in Christianity.
Exactly.
With this idea that God is in all things.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So fascinating. So you get to this certain point where you're starting to re-engage with your spirituality and to produce these sets of rituals in your life.
That's exactly.
So is that sort of where you're still at there?
So now it's kind of evolved a little bit in that, instead of sort of just doing my own thing all the time, I've now incorporated practices that have been taught to me.
Right.
So one of them is laying tobacco down. If I'm ever harvesting things in the woods, for medicine or for tea or anything like that, or stuff I want to eat, I try to always have some tobacco on me, because you always offer tobacco down to the earth or to entities that you're harvesting from as a way of showing gratitude and thanks. So that's a practice that I've incorporated back into mine as well. Another thing I do is if I'm doing a ritual on the land, or I'm, doing something that is what I would consider from a, whether it's Catholic or Celtic, I always try to ask or acknowledge the indigenous spirits here and just kind of let them know what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. I do that for a variety of ways, like tobacco, usually. And that's, for me, just a practice of saying, I'm bringing these practices here. These practices are important to me, but I also want to acknowledge the complex history of bringing practices here and try to kind of, symbolically state for myself and how I relate. This is not me trying to colonize or bring these practices to overwhelm what's already here. Right. This is, thank you for giving me the space to practice in the way I want to practice and relate to the land as I need to relate to the land.
So is there sort of a stream of other people who are doing this sort of thing?
Absolutely. There's different, like in Toronto right now. So there's people doing a bunch of different kind of syncretic stuff. There's a bit of a scene around it, which is fascinating. So,
what do you mean by that? A bit of a scene? Expand on that for me.
So there's a few different locations to get different materials. There's and the materials can include things like, we got the sage here. A lot of people use sage.
Yep, totally.
Tarot decks, candles. So there's a kind of there's a couple locations in Toronto that sell that kind of get up, and they're called technically they're called metaphysical supply stores. But I always grew up near one that was called the Occult Shop, and it's still called the Occult Shop.
Right.
Yeah.
And that would be a term that I think a lot of people would be more familiar with.
Yeah, and that's the term I like too.
Yeah, so at this point, I've got a really interesting idea of sort of your history of spiritual development and all of these different pieces and how they fit together. And some of them we've talked about before, and this is certainly the first time we've had that sort of flow.
Right.
Now that you've said your piece, and I feel like I've gotten a better idea of where you're getting from, let me put in the screws a little bit.
Sure, for sure.
And ask sort of, people have these ideas about occultism.
Yes.
I think we now have this really, really good idea of sort of where you came from and of this process that you took and, the ways in which you are practicing your spirituality and your relationship with land and with these rituals. But now we've sort of branched into this world of occultism, which has its own kind of baggage and background.
Definitely.
And I think the natural question for a lot of people is, it's pretty unavoidable for you to, if you're using this stuff, going to these places, learning about this stuff. It's pretty unavoidable for you to interact with that tradition.
Yes.
The things that people have said before about occultism, the way occultists act,
completely,
and talk. So how do you sort of the fact that a lot of people don't take that sort of so seriously.
No, for sure.
And that there are parts of it that were they as large and organized as, say, the Catholic Church, would be in many ways just as problematic.
Yes, absolutely.
So what, all of this is to ask you a very simple question. What is occultism? Yeah,
absolutely. So occultism comes from, as I know, the Latin occulto, which means hidden.
Yep.
So the idea is this is stuff that's hidden from society or hidden from the regular people in society. And that's the rooted of the word. That's the root of the word. Mm-hmm. And there's many societies that gets classified as a cult that people kind of, if they, there's a lot of cachet about this, it's something hidden, it's something forbidden, and that's what attracts people to it, or can attract people. I'm doing something that's, I'm not supposed to be doing, and, people got, these societies have secrets or truths about reality.
Secret knowledge, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And they, they're only going to give it, if I do this, they're going to give it to me. Scientology can operate on that basis, any of these ones.
Well, and that brings me right in.
Yeah.
That word occult, it has cult in it.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
And that to some people may not seem like a coincidence.
Mm-hmm. And to be fair, there is that element in kind of the spiritual quest, My family has, without going into details about them, on my dad's side, has an unfortunate interaction with cults, Uh-oh. Oh, yeah. That's a story for another time, maybe when we're off the air. But, so I've kind of always thought this is something I need to be careful of. And I've kind of gotten even caught up in cultish people who they've had a pull on me as well. And I had to kind of realize of when am I getting caught up something that's really unhealthy for me and take the step back. So that's an element of it. But one of the things I want to talk about is there's different kind of ways people approach or people who go to a place called the Occult Shop. There's different objectives that people want when they go there.
Right. So let's by all means, let's talk about that. But first, let's orient this thing, the Occult Shop, in terms of occultism. How do these two things relate?
Definitely. So occultism, generally, if you're going and studying one of the... Generally, also, these societies aren't hidden. There's a lot of information about them.
It's hard to be a hidden society and yet also have people know and care about you.
Exactly. And so, how they get around that is you got to actually go and be part of the society to get the real truth,
Yeah,
so that's what they talk about. So... What I mean by that, why that's useful, people who go to a place like the Occult Shop, some of them are interested in accessing this information about an occult society. So a lot of people are interested in Freemasonry, right? Freemasonry, which is very, a very historic historical institution that is also spiritual. That's a whole fascinating other topic. But so, for example, people go there and they buy books on the spiritual practices of Freemason. They want to find more about that. They want to get those secrets.
Totally.
There's a whole industry about, people who've claimed to dig up the secrets of Freemasonry and publish them.
Yeah, of course.
You can, find all that stuff on your own. You don't need, you don't, this isn't exactly really heavy lifting work, aside from just researching what's going on in these societies. All their practices, are very much out in the open. Mm-hmm. But so there are people interested in that quest, but also at an occult store, there's.
So sorry, there are two branches in the occult store.
Yeah,
one of them is what you just talked about.
Yeah, secrets, and there's people there's a whole bunch of people who want to access societies that are deemed secret or occult.
Right. So you got people going for secret societies, and then what's the second branch?
The other is people going to just find materials for their practices. Right. So, and this is when I go to the occult shop or the metaphysical supply store, whatever you want to call it, I prefer the occult shop because that's how we grew up with it. But, you have people who are practicing Santeria, and they're not worried about that stuff being hidden, they're just trying to get the candles or the other material that they're going to use in their rituals. And they're not there to kind of, access things that are forbidden or sort of have that cachet about I'm in the cult. They're just no, I'm just using this as a store where I buy what I need to go pray.
So what's up with that marriage between those two things that they seem like pretty different things?
Definitely.
Why have they ended up in the same store together?
It's fascinating to me. I think if I could theorize about this, because I don't know too much about the concrete history of the occult or spirituality in Toronto. Mm-hmm. I have a feeling that
and I would say also that I think this split you've noticed is it extends far beyond Toronto. That if you go to occult shops across the world, you're probably going to see similar divisions.
Absolutely.
Between these people who are interested in secret societies and secrets and people who are looking for supplies to support their rituals.
Definitely. Exactly. And I think the stores, the occult shops or supply stores, whatever you want to call them, they arise out of the direct needs of the community they find themselves in. So
yes, of course.
For Toronto, because Toronto is extremely multicultural, but the area that the occult shop is, which is close to Little Jamaica up on the west side near Eglinton and in Vaughan area. A lot of people who are are from Jamaican ancestry, they go there and they practice Santeria. And so that's part of what they carry at that store. But there's also a lot of New Agey folks. So which is another whole thing. But and New Age is kind of just putting sort of, I think it is kind of syncretic in that it's people just trying to find old practices and bring them into the new age. So you get a lot of people interested in Buddhism, interested in kind of Wicca comes out of that, which is
the witch tradition.
Witch tradition, exactly. And I don't want to put any of that down, but it's a very different tradition. Mm-hmm. Very white, if we may say so, stereotypically. Right. It's very, very. And
white women,
exactly, and to a lesser extent white men, exactly, white middle-aged women. That's the stereotype of that. So those are also the people going to that store. And then you have some of the guys who are into the dark stuff, because there's a dark edge to all of this, and they're the ones who are looking at things where they want to maybe cause harm to others spiritually, or they want to get back at somebody. They want to.
Do you think that's more in line with the spiritual practice side? You're talking sort of voodoo, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, voodoo is a part of it, and I don't want to voodoo is...
There's also a bunch of other traditions.
There's a bunch of other traditions.
Sort of stereotypical
idea, yeah.
And so, but sorry, which side do you think that stuff falls more closely on? Do you think it's closer to the people performing ritual side of things, or do you think it's closer to the people interested in secret societies and the mystical powers that they contain?
I think a little bit of both. I think because some of these traditions do have these sort of more for lack of a better word, like more kind of shadow practices or dark practices. A lot of traditions do have that within them. I'm not going to kind of say more on that. I don't want to make a judgment on that. If I was coming from the context of their religions, I'd probably have a lot of darkness in my spirituality too. But I think as well, there's a whole sort of aspect of the occult that is engaged with, how to access or communicate or even get powers that, are seen by sort of the church as really diabolic, how to get them to serve you as well.
Right. So they're kind of set up in opposition to this more traditional theology.
And that's because, the Western occult tradition or hidden tradition arose out of, perceived persecution by the church. And often it was, these guys talking about demons from hell and getting access to them.
Yeah, totally.
And then they were labeled heretics later. And there's the whole history of grimoires or spell books or, there's one of the big books is called a Goetia. And that's a lower key of Solomon, it's called. And those are according, to tradition. All the demons that Solomon had serve him, you can now get in a book and summon them yourself.
Yeah. Well, by creating this narrative of things that are powerful in the world,
exactly,
dark, you sort of necessarily create a bunch of people who suddenly become interested in perhaps how to harness those powers.
Exactly. And, those kind of books are available at a place like the Occult Shop as well. Now, interestingly enough, and this goes back to kind of, who these stores serve, a lot of the Occult Shop's old in Toronto, but a lot of the more recent ones, they don't have anything like that. They don't have anything like a demonology or a section or anything like that. A lot of them proclaim like we're only doing light work, or light work is like the word people use.
There's like this sort of division within these places.
Exactly.
There are forces for light and
forces for evil.
Yeah.
Exactly. And a lot of people who do light work, they don't engage in it's called shadow work by a lot of people who are working in the darkness. And they just don't want to have anything to do with that. And they've set up shops that don't have anything like that. So these kind of stores arise out of the needs of the communities that surround them. And Toronto is fascinating because it has all these different streams in it's my understanding, its oldest occult shop. Some place like New York has, because it's such a divided city and segregated city, you have up top where I was, where a lot of Caribbean folks and Dominican people who practice Santeria, they go to their own kind of shops where you just get that material.
And there's more of a division.
Exactly. And then you go downtown, and those are the stores where wealthier people come who are new agey. They don't have the same kind of mixing that I've seen in Toronto. They're very different sort of occults or spiritual traditions.
So I guess the bit that fits to me very naturally into this is the path. We've seen sort of how these places can serve as sort of spiritual guides. And then I think we've also seen that there is overlap between these two sort of different paths that you've illuminated. Right. The one sort of secret society kind of path where people are more interested in gaining access to forbidden knowledge.
Yes.
And then the more sort of spiritual path where people are going in order to get things to help them with their practices.
Exactly.
And these two paths have some considerable amount of overlap depending on the individual itself.
Absolutely.
So this leads, I think, to the most common criticism of this sort of spirituality and this sort of way of interacting with the world.
Definitely.
And that is through the hidden knowledge path and through its direct relationship with how conspiracy works.
Yes, absolutely.
Because that promise of occultism, of hidden knowledge, is the exact same promise that a conspiracy theory holds.
Yes.
That you have hidden knowledge of the world.
Exactly.
So does that sort of relationship bother you in terms of you tapping into, like, sure, you're clearly tapping into the more ritualistic aspect, but you're also definitely supporting and have to be engaged to a certain amount. I am going to put forward that you may have to support and be engaged to a certain amount with this more problematic conspiracy side of things.
Definitely, and you always have to rub shoulders with those type of folks when you go to a place like this, or people who like that. dimension of it. I often also find that, so one of the fascinating conspiratorial organizations is called Skull and Bones.
Skull and Bones.
Skull and Bones.
That's the Yale
Secret Society. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I read actually a really good book on Skull and Bones that was called Secrets of the Tomb. And it was by a journalist who went to Yale as part of another secret society. And, was dealing at the time with all this mythology about Skull and Bones and how they were this all-powerful occult organization that planted people in every, form of government and stuff like that.
All the business leaders.
And she actually broke that down and broke what about these kind of presuppositions are true and not true. Mm-hmm. And I sort of, one of the theories I had from reading this book, because the truth is of course much more complicated, is that there is the reason that network kind of allows these sort of ideas about it to circulate is that it grants it more power than it actually has.
Right.
Skull and Bones, the Old Boy Network is powerful, but is not all powerful.
No.
No. It has significant influence over certain sections of the U.S. government historically. It's not clear how much that has...
but in a way, that's less because of the actual organization itself and more just because you have a concentration of
really powerful people
who are all know each other.
And they formed one of the key things is, these kind of secret societies that do meet and do kind of practice their occult rituals or whatever else they do is they form relationships with each other.
Yeah.
And that is extremely important to remember. You're, as an 18-year-old going into one of these secret societies, you're going at a time when you're very impressionable.
Right.
And the whole idea is you're meeting people who are going to be like a brotherhood or fraternity for life.
Right.
You got your back, they got your back, and you have their back.
They are basically a frat.
And they are basically a frat. They are basically a frat. They are absolutely like a frat. A very, very powerful, sustained frat that's been in operation for a really long time. Yeah.
So I guess to move you back over the coals a little bit. You're welcome. You haven't really sort of addressed the conspiracy angle.
Definitely.
Stuff yet.
Well, and part of it is because, when you go and engage in, I've also, found myself, as I was researching, especially some of the more occult stuff, I found myself going along conspiracy theory lines, and I had to sort of take a step back and be like, wait, is this making sense to me? Is this, is this something I want to continue down? So even within myself, I found that danger that you're talking about, a very real and visceral danger.
Because when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was a kid, there were at least a couple times where I encountered these websites that were just blatant conspiracy theories.
Yes.
And I read and I started to fall down a bit of a rabbit hole.
Yeah, totally.
And for some of them, there was even like a couple-hour period where all of a sudden I was questioning sort of this basic aspect of reality. And
excuse me,
there are two I remember most clearly. There's the one about how the Illuminati rules the world.
Yes,
and they control everything. I spent at least a couple hours, almost half, kind of believing in that.
Definitely.
And I'm more cynical now, perhaps, than I was then, but I've always been pretty skeptical.
Right.
But the other one was, one of them was the Illuminati, and the other one was the aliens at some place in the United States. Like
Area 51?
No, it's more than 51. There's like a crash. And there's a whole conspiracy page devoted
Roswell.
Yeah, exactly.
Roswell, New Mexico, that's right.
A whole conspiracy theory page just devoted to like explaining how the government was covering up the fact that aliens had crashed at Roswell or something.
Yes.
And it's hard to tell, in retrospect, how legitimate the progenitors of these sites are.
Yeah.
But over time, as I've learned more and I've seen more stuff, at the time, I read it, I fell for it a little bit, I did some of my own research, I pulled myself out of it. Mm-hmm. I've always been pretty good at researching things and trying to get other opinions in, and that's basically the anathema to conspiracy theories.
Yes.
Like if you look outside of the theory, because the way they work is they cover you in this like wall of evidence that seems to you totally conclusive, and they like suck you into this pit. And then if you look outside of it and you see comparably massive walls of evidence that
discount that theory,
discount that, all of a sudden the appeal is lost.
Right.
The ability to drag you into this hole is just severely diminished.
Definitely.
So this relationship with conspiracy and occultism is a problem, I think.
Yes.
Because conspiracy theories are, to me, legitimately damaging and problematic things in the world.
Yes.
I stumbled into them a couple times as a kid.
Right.
Never really held on to them very long, but also, in many ways, was really conditioned just to sort of not be drawn in by this sort of stuff.
Definitely.
Partly by the way I was raised, partly by sort of an innate lack of spirituality myself. That those sorts of things just have I'm just a bad target audience for them. For
sure.
So I feel real fear thinking of people who maybe don't have that background, don't have those skills.
Definitely.
Just getting pulled in and sucked into this world where aliens are real and the U.S. government is covering it up, or the Illuminati is a secret organization that controls the world, or Donald J. Trump is secretly trying to destroy a pedophile ring that the Democrats are supporting.
Absolutely.
So the fact that you're sort of this place of occult worship, this place where you are engaged and sort of have as an important part of the way you engage spiritually.
Yes.
That it is also kind of feeding into this same set of traditions and problematic ideas about the world. Strikes me as an issue. And I'm curious how you resolve that.
No, absolutely. Now, one of the key things is that what I kind of sort of think about with that is that I have been also given the gift of having the ability to kind of self-critique. You know, I've been, I have, whether it's the, my own internal mechanisms or the relationships I have with people that can kind of reach down and bring me back from the brink when I need it, I have been able to view when I've been going down a path that is self-destructive.
Right.
I think
so far,
and that's
good luck.
No, absolutely. Definitely. I think these, people can go in search of spirituality when they're hurt and when they have suffered under a certain narrative that they've lived by or lived under that no longer seems tenable for them.
And that's when they can be really vulnerable.
And that's when they can be really vulnerable to these kind of things. Absolutely. I also think, at a certain level, one of the ways to counteract that is to spread awareness of this danger, and because spirituality can be incredibly healing for people, and it can, this is why, the kind of people who are interested in this more conspiratorial side of things also have to shop next to folks like Mike McTague, the elder I worked with, who's committed his life and his traditions to healing people in the criminal justice system through his sweat lodges and other practices. Incredibly important healing work.
Of course.
That is also verifiable based on, how these people have responded to his work. So...
And how they've lived their lives.
Definitely. I think, and this is why, a lot of the shops have gone along with and said, we're only doing the light stuff. We're only doing light work at this shop. We don't have...
To deal with that sort of conspiracy angle.
Exactly. And I'm not saying that the stuff they have isn't always conspiratorial, but it's definitely... not interested in, doesn't have the same obsession with the negative or the degrading aspects of culture and of occultism. It's one thing if you think fairies exist versus going down a rabbit hole, and kind of just go down this all-consuming occult understanding of how U.S. power works.
Yes.
If I might understand. There's differences between that, that I think are very key. At the same time, I think it's important to, and this is goes back to, like, you know, in many ways you could put yourself in medieval Europe in the shoes of somebody in kind of Catholicism, you know, understanding that, okay, if we have a bunch of people suddenly having access to, you know, scripture at this time, which, you know, was you know, a very accurate representation of reality, or we had things, you know, that were considered apocryphal that shouldn't be included in the Bible. Like, there were legitimate concerns, I think, that some of these people had, whether or not you see the results as legitimate, that, you know, this stuff isn't good if it gets out in the hands of people who can't understand, you know, it as not untrue, you know? Like, we shouldn't have maybe a book that summons all these demons available in the hands of everybody, you know? So that is a historical struggle that kind of these large religious institutions have sort of had. At the same time, then you have the issue of, should they be made available? In a society where we do have freedom of information and people should be free to access, you know, different kinds of information, where is the place that, where's the kind of, you know, there's tension between that and the tendency for that information, some of that information, to lead people on very dangerous roads.
Right.
You know, should people still have the freedom to go down those roads if they so choose, you know? So I think a lot. Sorry, yeah, that's brought up a lot for me, but you know,
no problem. Yeah, so because there are sort of two big things that I'm getting out of that, and one of them is that by having these things occupy the same space,
right,
you can have dialogue between these individuals, some of whom are crazier, for want of a better term, than others, or who are perhaps going down the bad path.
Yes, absolutely.
And these people who are in the same area can assist.
Definitely.
And sort of help steer them back onto something that is a little closer to reality.
Definitely.
And then the other thing I think you're kind of addressing, but I'll bring it up again and give
absolutely.
you a shot to gather your thoughts a little bit, is, you know, envision somebody sort of being genuinely concerned about this.
Yes.
And saying, look, there's a certain way that is real in the world. It's really clear that these guys are just going ham and going all the way off the board with it. They're distorting the reality. It's having negative effects in the world. We need to do more, and people need to fix this stuff. And, you know, maybe we don't ban the books or burn them because we're for freedom of information. But there needs to be a way to present this information in a way that makes it clear that it's false.
Absolutely.
What do you like? What's your sort of?
I completely agree with you, man. And one of the things that I want to do, because I am interested in the history of different spiritual and religious traditions, is talk about where these traditions and histories come from, you know? And I think spreading that information is really key, especially as people are interested in that. I also have met people who are proprietors at these shops, and in a way certain gatekeepers of that, who do a good job of kind of helping lost, wearied souls come in and saying, like, you know, but they will, you know, the one I'm thinking of in particular, he's this guy who's tattooed with all these skulls and stuff like that, you know, has like half of his head shaved. Nice guy though, but he, you know, he'll talk to somebody.
There's
and
that Catholic bias,
you know, absolutely. I know, right? Nice dude though, but he practices Santeria as far as I know, and other things like that. I'm sure, I think he worships Satan as well. But anyway, you know, he does a good job of being a proprietor of that shop, in my opinion. You know, he will talk with somebody and say, do you really want to buy this? Are you sure you know what you're getting into? Do you want to come get this? But if they're of age and he can't literally find any reason legally to say you shouldn't have this, he will sell it to them. But he will chat with them and say, do you know this tradition that you're getting into?
And
do you know
engage them.
Exactly, and engage them. But I think as well is, like, you know, it is important to study some of this occult stuff, because in a scholarly and important way, because it has interacted with the historical development of power in North America, in the world in generally, but in particular in North America. For example, you know, whether or not you believe in Freemasons, some of the founding fathers did. And that tradition carries a lot more complexity than most people's understanding of it.
Right.
So, for example, the Freemasonry tradition, there's all these legends about it, where it came from. People believe it came out of the Crusades and stuff like that. But what it literally and historically was a society that arose in England, where during the lead up to and after the Reformation, where Catholics and Protestant intellectuals could still meet with each other and talk behind closed doors and not have. Where in the streets they had to be bitter enemies, but in the Freemason Freemason society they could be friends and have actual conversations. That's an important feature of Freemasonry and the tradition of Freemasonry that people just don't understand.
So I guess the thing I want to end on is just the part that's interesting to me as somebody. And we did end up talking about me, and maybe we can talk.
We
more
can
about
do
me
maybe next time. Yeah, exactly.
But the thing that I think is kind of funny and interesting to me at the end of the day is that if you admit that these conspiracy theories are an issue, this ability to warp people's reality is an issue, then you are also forced to admit that these occult places give people real power over the way reality works. You are forced to admit that if it has the ability to sort of really corrupt and mess people up, that it also has the ability to change people's lives for the better.
Exactly.
So that is sort of gives you a route to having some sort of power and having some sort of legitimacy.
Absolutely.
In a way that might not be apparent from a more cursory examination.
Definitely.
Subject.
And one thing, just that one last thought, if that's okay, is talking to an elder like Mike McTeague and understanding the complexity of these traditions, because they do change the way people perceive reality, especially if they want to do that. People study them for a really long time. I remember talking and hearing that somebody spent, years learning how to be a firekeeper, almost 10 years, for example, which is an important role in that tradition because, you have power.
Exactly. When you want to use it properly.
And you want to use it properly, and this is why it takes a really long time to become a priest, for example, and go through a priesthood. If you want to you can't just sign up and become a Jesuit. You go through a very long ordination process. And that's important, Totally. And one of the keys is that I think these non-Christian and European and traditions in North America, is important to recognize is people do see the power of bad medicine, and this is unhealthy, derogatory spiritual pathways, and they've taken the steps as best as they can, spiritual leaders in those communities, to counteract that.
Totally.
But that danger is always there.
All right, buddy. So last thing, I guess. I may have a bit of a question for myself as well, but mostly I just want to ask you.
Totally.
This one is a very you one. What, looking back at yourself in the future, what sort of changes do you wish to see, or things that you wish to remain constant? What's your perspective on how you want your spirituality to progress going
Absolutely.
forwards?
Well, I think your question of helping people find the right paths or more benevolent, beneficial paths versus the negative ones, I want to be involved in that. Like, I want to help people who are questing to, give them some warning signs, help them be a guide, whether that's through YouTube channels or just writing or a combination of different ways of
talking to people in occult shops.
Talking to people in occult shops, that's something I really think is important and valuable. And that's something I want to continue to do.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot,
All right.
buddy.
Thanks, man. That was great.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Feet a little sore there.
Yeah.